Brent Staples is very well qualified to talk about this subject matter because of his copious amounts of personal experience with it. He's a black male who was born in 1951 in Chester, Pennsylvania. His particular experiences from moving to Chicago and first realizing how stature affected those around him judged him as a person give good examples as to how people like him can be misconceived by the general public. He grew up in a place where it was common for him to see tough people being hauled away by the police, and it taught him from a very young age to remain a shadow and timid, yet a survivor. His language in this part of his essay exemplifies how difficult his life was and how hard he tried to be accepted as a non-hostile. As well as learning about his immediate effect on people from his personal experiences, he has had many writing opportunities, including being on the editorial board for the New York Times and several other magazines which are credible sources that are reliable with good writers. He's had a lot of involvement in writing, and his essay, Just Walk On By, Black Men in Public Space, is the perfect way to show people that black men are the same people on the inside as everyone else. Brent Staples wrote this essay partly due to his time frame. It was written in 1986 and it was originally published by Ms. Magazine. During this time, there was racism and prejudice in American people against black people. There was lots. In this essay, he includes a story about how he was mistakenly taken for a burglar when he was trying to hand in a late story. He was chased through his work, and he had to hurriedly find a coworker that could vouch for him so that the security guard would not try to arrest him. He uses this story to present how prominent racism still is, and even in his workplace where he uses a story to present how prominent racism still is, even in his workplace where he was known. Staples wrote his essay and included these stories as a way to share his experiences with this common phenomenon of racism that was happening to black people all across the country. He was hoping that with this essay, when audiences read it, they could gain some perspective about how black people feel when things similar to Staples' personal stories happen to others. Due to the time period and the own awareness of those around him, Staples wanted to inform the public and perhaps change the way they act around black citizens for the better. Brent Staples had a major intended audience for his essay, but the readers extended beyond who he originally wanted to have read it. The intended audience for Staples' essay is primarily women, as stated in the italicized text before the essay begins, but that is only the editor's opinion. Although the editor declared the primary intended audience is women, the essay has information that everybody should know regardless of race and gender. Just Walk On By, Black Men in Public Space mainly targets women as the audience because they are the people most affected by people like Staples. Most of his stories include women being afraid of him and quickening their pace or giving him a wide berth when walking by him so they do not get too close. Staples states that he understands their fear of him because women are particularly vulnerable to street violence and young black males are drastically overrepresented among perpetrators of that violence. He uses words vulnerable and perpetrator. His use of the words vulnerable and perpetrators of violence enforce how serious of an issue this is and how we need to take into account that black people in the news do not encompass the entire race. His essay can also be perceived by children and men as well, because even though violence most often happens against women, it does not only happen against women. He does state in his essay that at night when walking by cars, we can hear the thunk, 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 thunk of the driver, black, white, male, female, hammering down door locks, showing that it is not only women who feel fear towards him. All communities are addressed in Staples' essay. That way he can spread awareness of the widespread issue of people feeling fear towards harmless black people walking in the street. Just Walk On By uses many rhetorical appeals to sway the public to believe his argument. Staples mostly uses ethos in building his credibility as a writer of the subject by telling us stories because they are all personal experiences. His essay is credible because Staples is not telling a story about another person where information may get skewed or be untruthful. He only wants to inform the public of things he has learned and noticed about the way strangers act around him. He uses pathos by inserting some humor, describing himself as a softy, scarcely able to take a knife to a raw chicken, and ethos by describing feeling surprised, embarrassed, and dismayed by the reactions of people he does not even know running away from him because they think he could be a mugger, rapist, or even worse. Combining ethos and pathos in his essay creates a powerful aspect because without them, much of the overall meaning would be lost or weaker in feeling. In his several stories relaying similar outcomes of the nervous behaviors of strangers, from women sprinting away from him into the night and others shooting him apprehensive looks while trying to walk by him, giving him a wide berth, his essay is quite persuasive in using these rhetorical appeals to convince the public to not make a snap judgment call on somebody just because of their looks. His essay is important for young people to read in our generation because racism is still prominent in today's world. It's made of stories that are non-fictional, that way they can gain real perspective about how people like him feel every day. Ethos, pathos, and logos were not the only rhetorical appeals Staples used to argue his point. His prose and analysis of his own life experiences in his essay portray real thoughts that cannot be falsified or embellished into fakery. His language contributing to pathos, such as timid, vulnerable, and fear, all create an atmosphere that makes the reader feel sorry for him. It makes us, as the audience, want to do better and help prevent more situations like this from happening in the future. He has similar settings for all of his stories as they take place in public spaces where other people are fearful of him. These settings provide the basis for understanding what someone like him go through in their life, and he illustrates the repetition in his life. Reiterating similar stories and all of them having a common background reinforces the fact that actions like the lady in the jewelry store bringing out a threatening dog to back him out of her store happen quite often. In all these stories, he elaborates at the end that he tries everything he can to avoid scaring people, and even if it is a major inconvenience to him. Just Walk On By is organized in a way that Staples can make his main point through personal stories of him, interspersed with tidbits about how his stories made him and the public feel. It was an effort to demonstrate how different he was from the public and how unnecessary the public's reactions to him were. His writing style makes us want to read more about him. I believe that it is a very effective way to get the reader's attention and hold it because his stories were unique and interesting, unlike any essay I've read about racism before. Gaining the audience's attention is one of the first steps to a good essay, and his first line, being "My first victim was a woman," ropes us into wanting to learn more about what he means by that and read more about his life. With each of his paragraphs, he introduces a new idea or story, preventing the reader from becoming bored by reading the same main point again and again. He talks about women in particular because that was his main intended audience, but in each of his stories he outlines a different scenario that can be translated to any gender or race being afraid of him. Along with using several personal examples to showcase these incidents of the public being afraid of him, he explains in each one how none of it is necessary and yet it still happens because of the stereotypes against people like him. He knows that he seems indistinguishable from the muggers that sometimes prowl that area at night, and it frightens those who do not know him. Through his entire essay, the structure of his stories with explanation as to why the reactions were not needed is a very effective way to keep the reader entertained and paying attention while simultaneously informing them of his main points. Overall, Staples created a very strong argument describing racism in his world. His language contributed to making the audience feel sorry for him and convince them that they wanted to make a change in how the public views black people. He is very effective in pointing out that although many people on the news doing evil things are black people, it does not relate to all black people. He proves that theory through personal stories of himself and how the public reacts to him even though he's doing nothing wrong. The structure of his stories and his essay are organized in a way that makes it easier for the audience to follow along in a way that is understandable and usable for future reference. All of these rhetorical choices that Staples used in Just Walk On By, Black Men in Public Space contribute to making and arguing his main point that racism is still excessive in the world and needs to be stopped.